The world they shared was colder, sharper, and more volatile than anything humans experience today. Europe and Western Asia, once the domain of mammoths, woolly rhinos, cave lions, and endless waves of advancing and retreating ice, was a place shaped by extremes. It was here, in this vast and rugged landscape, that two kinds of humans lived side by side. They were not strangers separated by worlds or epochs. They were neighbors, competitors, occasional partners, and perhaps, at times, bitter enemies. For more than 250,000 years, Neanderthals thrived across this northern world. Their bodies were built for brutality. Wide rib cages, thick bones, powerful limbs, and skulls shaped by a lineage that had adapted to deep cold before anatomically modern humans even existed. They were not simple or primitive. They fashioned tools with remarkable precision. They crafted symbolic objects. They buried their dead. They lived in small, tight-knit bands that moved seasonally through valleys and ridges, as comfortable in caves as they were in open plains. Then, out of Africa, came another kind of human, smaller-bodied but incredibly efficient at long-distance travel, smarter in some ways, more flexible in others, driven by curiosity, pushed by climate, and shaped by their own ancestral struggles. These newcomers, our ancestors, followed the warm corridors northward, riverbeds, grasslands, coastal routes. They brought with them a different toolkit, a different social structure, and perhaps a very different way of imagining the world. For a long time, the two species didn't collide. The world was spacious enough to keep them apart. Early encounters may have been fleeting, two hunting parties passing on a ridge, distant silhouettes at the edge of a forest, a discarded spear tip found in the mud, suggesting that another people hunted these grounds. But eventually, the climate shifted again. Forests retreated. Game herds migrated in tighter and more predictable paths. Cold advances squeezed populations into smaller pockets of habitable land. And suddenly, the world was not so wide anymore. By 60,000 years ago, the boundaries between Neanderthal and Homo sapiens territory almost certainly blurred. Humans moved north into the Levant and Anatolia. Neanderthals dipped south or east, depending on the climate pulse of the century. Geography became a shared space rather than a quiet border. Every valley, every migration corridor, every river crossing could now be a meeting point or a battleground. The first encounters may have been wary. Two intelligent beings, each shaped by vastly different histories, now stood face to face. They saw something familiar, eyes, posture, hands, but also something undeniably other. An echo of themselves that spoke in different rhythms, hunted with different rituals, and carried a different ancestral fire. Whether those early meetings were peaceful or hostile remains one of the greatest unanswered questions in human prehistory. There is no written memory, no carved account, no preserved epic of that first gaze between species. But we know one thing with certainty. They did meet. They crossed paths for thousands of years. They exchanged genes. They shared landscapes. Their worlds touch so deeply that every person alive outside Africa today carries a small trace of Neanderthal blood. This mingling, this overlap of destinies, sets the stage for the mystery at the heart of our investigation. Did sharing the same world lead to cooperation, coexistence, or conflict? The archaeological record is fragmentary, scattered like broken chapters of a book that time refuses to fully give back. But what it does reveal is this: the two species were not separated by impassable barriers. They inhabited the same Europe, the same caves, the same hunting grounds, the same Ice Age storms. And once two intelligent apex predators share the same world, the question is no longer if they interacted, but how deeply? This documentary begins in that deep uncertainty, where shadows, bones, and ancient landscapes whisper their truths without ever raising their voices. It is in this quiet, in this cold shared world, that we must ask the first, most important question. What happens when two kinds of humans are forced to live side by side? If Segment 1 laid the landscape, Segment 2 walks us directly into the narrow corridors where two human worlds collided. This is the part of the story where everything becomes tighter: food, territory, safety, and the very question of who belongs where. Because if the Ice Age world was vast, the habitable Ice Age world was not. Warm valleys, river crossings, and strategic routes through mountains became choke points where fate pushed the two species together. Archaeologists call these places contact zones, regions where material evidence from both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens appears in overlapping layers. These are the fingerprints of coexistence. They are the places where the story becomes tangible. The Levant was one of the earliest of these zones. For tens of thousands of years, Neanderthals and modern humans alternated their presence there like dancers, following a rhythm we still don't fully understand. Sometimes Neanderthals occupied the caves. Then, climate shifted, the land warmed, and Homo sapiens moved in. Later, a cooling phase pushed them south again, opening space for Neanderthals to return. The region didn't belong to one species or the other. It belonged to whoever the climate favored that millennium. Farther north, the Caucasus served as a second great meeting place. Here, mountain passes funneled migrations into narrow paths where signs of both species accumulate in close proximity. Stone tools from one people lie beside tools from the other, sometimes only inches apart in sediment, but separated by hundreds or thousands of years. It's a reminder that contact did not necessarily mean continuous interaction. Sometimes it meant long-distance awareness. Sometimes it meant indirect knowledge, the way one clan might know another exists by finding their abandoned hearth. But contact zones were not just travel corridors. They were also resource intersections. The richest hunting grounds, the river-fed plains where herds gathered in spring, the sheltered valleys where game wintered over, the coastal coves filled with shellfish and seals, acted like magnets. If two intelligent species hunted the same animals, seasonality would drag them into the same places again and again. And where species overlap, tension lives. The archaeological record suggests both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were skilled and adaptable, but in different ways. Neanderthals hunted large mammals up close, relying on strength, coordination, and deep knowledge of the terrain. Modern humans hunted from a distance with lighter projectiles and solved problems with flexible group strategies. In many contact zones, it wasn't that one species was superior, it was that they were optimized differently. And in a changing climate, optimization mattered. In some regions, Neanderthals appear to have retreated deeper into forests or highlands as modern humans expanded. In others, the pattern reverses, with Neanderthals holding prime land long after humans arrived. These mosaics, these patches of shifting dominance, show that coexistence wasn't unilateral. It was dynamic, negotiated on a scale measured by millennia. Then there is the genetic evidence, perhaps the most haunting proof of true contact. All non-African humans alive today inherited fragments of Neanderthal DNA, a molecular echo of interbreeding events that happened in or near these contact zones. Geneticists estimate that these unions took place early in the meeting between species, perhaps when contact was still rare and curiosity outweighed fear. The DNA suggests not just a meeting of bodies, but a meeting of worlds. Whether those unions happened through partnership, exchange, or coercion, we cannot say. But they tell us this: contact was not just ecological, it was intimate, and contact zones were not isolated. They rippled outward. Stories would be told around fires. Trails would be avoided or claimed. Territories might be defended more aggressively once a band realized the strangers across the valley were not animals, but people. People who hunted like them, thought like them, and desired the same land. Some archaeologists think these zones were mostly peaceful edges where information and genes flowed. Others believe they were pressure points, places where coexistence strained to its limits, where fear and competition simmered beneath every encounter. What we know for certain is that these zones existed everywhere from the Levant to France to Siberia. They formed the mosaic where the fate of two species intertwined. They were the places where Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were no longer abstractions to each other but direct presences, footprints in the same mud, the same mammoth skull split open for marrow, the same narrow paths through winter snow. And every contact zone asks the same silent question. When two intelligent species share the same ground, how long does coexistence last before conflict, whether subtle or overt, begins? By the time both species firmly occupied the same continents, the Ice Age world had already set the rules of survival. It was a place where the climate swung like a pendulum, cold phases locking the land under glacial ice, warmer intervals opening meadows rich with game. Every shift redrew the map of what was habitable and what was not. In such a world, competition was not a matter of ambition or expansion. It was a matter of staying alive. Neanderthals and Homo sapiens both relied heavily on large herbivores: reindeer, horses, bison, mammoths, ibex, and red deer. These animals were the batteries of Ice Age life. They provided calories, fat, bone marrow, clothing, shelter, tools, and fuel. But their migrations could be unpredictable. Their herds might change course with a sudden cold snap or a shift in vegetation. When the herds moved, the people moved. And when two species of human followed the same animals, overlap was inevitable. This overlap sets the stage for the heart of the question: did competition for resources lead to conflict? To answer that, we first have to understand how differently the two species hunted and lived. Neanderthals were built for close-range, high-risk hunting. They relied on strength, teamwork, and intimate knowledge of the land. Their spears were heavier, meant to be thrust rather than thrown. They stalked prey at dangerously close distances, likely ambushing from cover or driving animals into traps in ravines or narrow passes. Their injuries, broken limbs, compressed vertebrae, damaged ribs, mirror the trauma patterns of modern rodeo riders. This alone reveals how hazardous their hunting style was. Humans, on the other hand, carried lighter spears, better projectiles, and eventually atlatls, simple leverage tools that allowed a hunter to throw a spear farther, harder, and more accurately than the arm alone could manage. With distance came safety. With safety came more predictable success. And with success came population growth. More people required more food. More food required more land. And more land meant competition. Territory becomes a deeply meaningful concept when survival depends on it. A valley rich in reindeer could sustain only so many hunters before the land began to strain. A river teeming with salmon might feed a band for months, but only if another band didn't claim it first. Every reliable shelter, every cave, every water source, every choke point on a migration route mattered. Neanderthals, with their smaller population densities and deep familiarity with their home ranges, likely viewed certain territories as ancestral. Humans, with their higher mobility, could sweep into new zones quickly, filling ecological niches that Neanderthals once held. This wasn't just competition between groups. It was competition between survival strategies. Where Neanderthals invested in profound knowledge of a single region, every hill, every cave, every migration route, humans thrived on flexibility. They pushed into new landscapes with surprising speed, adapting to different prey, different seasons, and different habitats. Their social networks were larger, stretching across bands and regions. Trade or knowledge sharing extended farther. Ideas diffused faster. Flexibility versus familiarity, mobility versus mastery, numbers versus strength. These differences created pressure points long before any direct confrontation. Imagine a harsh winter where reindeer congregated in only a handful of valleys. Imagine two intelligent, hungry populations arriving at the same site. No written language, no negotiated treaties, no shared customs, only instinct, scarcity, and fear. Conflict need not erupt in pitched battles or organized raids. Competition can be subtle, slow-moving, even invisible in the archaeological record. It can look like one species slowly shrinking in range as the other expands. It can look like a band of Neanderthals changing their migration route, not because of a fight, but because a rival group had already set snares along the river. It can look like the quiet erosion of territory, season by season, generation by generation. And then there is population size. Humans reproduced slightly faster. They formed larger groups. They exchanged mates across greater distances, reducing inbreeding stress. A larger population can absorb loss, illness, famine, or conflict in ways small populations cannot. This alone could tilt the balance without a single violent encounter. But competition is not only ecological. It is also cognitive. Humans had long-distance networks that allowed them to share not just goods, but ideas, stoneworking methods, strategies for hunting, techniques for preserving food. Innovation spread, weapons improved, tools became more specialized. And as the climate grew harsher around 50,000 to 40,000 years ago, these differences mattered more and more. Some archaeologists propose this period as the tipping point, a moment when competition became less passive and more direct. Not necessarily war, but friction, tension, the kind of pressure that exists when two apex predators occupy the same shrinking world. If there were conflicts, they might not have been epic clashes. More likely they were brief skirmishes, territorial warnings, sudden ambushes, or small-scale raids. Nothing that would leave clear, unambiguous signatures in the soil. Nothing that time could not erase. But the outcome, gradual or abrupt, was unmistakable. One species prospered, the other declined. Competition did not need to be violent to change the fate of the Neanderthals. It only needed to be sustained, pressured, unequal, and unrelenting. It is in this long arc of competition, not a single moment but 1,000 overlapping ones, that the possibility of outright conflict begins to emerge. Competition set the groundwork, scarcity sharpened it. And the fragile balance of coexistence began to tilt toward something darker. The question now becomes unavoidable. If competition grew fierce enough, did it spill into violence? If the first 3 segments showed us the world in which conflict could arise, this is the segment where we stare directly into the physical evidence, the scars left behind in bone, stone, and sediment. This is where the Ice Age speaks most clearly, because bones do not lie. Weapons cannot hide their purpose. And trauma, when interpreted with care, can reveal both how people lived and how they sometimes died. But the truth is complicated. For every injury that hints at violence, another might be the result of hunting or accident. For every stone point embedded in bone, we must ask, whose weapon was it? How was it used? Was it aimed at prey or at a rival? And yet, when all the evidence is considered together, patterns begin to emerge. Patterns that force us to contemplate whether humans and Neanderthals ever crossed the line from competition to conflict. The weapons they carried. Both species created tools sharp enough to kill. That is undeniable. But the designs of their tools shaped how they fought, how they hunted, and how they might have confronted one another. Neanderthal weapons were heavy, close-range thrusting spears with thick wooden shafts and broad stone tips. They were powerful, but they demanded proximity. To use one effectively against a deer or a rival, you had to be close enough to feel breath and see eyes. Homo sapiens, by contrast, engineered lighter, more aerodynamic projectiles. Even before atlatls and bows appeared, humans were already throwing lighter spears at surprising distances. Their stone points were often smaller and more standardized, optimized for flight rather than impact. If two human species ever clashed, this difference alone would have shaped the outcome. Close-range power versus long-range precision. Momentum versus strategy. Strength versus reach. These contrasts do not prove conflict, but they shape any imagined encounter. Trauma in the bones. Neanderthal skeletons show an extraordinary number of healed injuries: broken arms, cracked ribs, shattered facial bones, and spinal compressions. For decades, researchers interpreted these injuries as evidence of a violent lifestyle. But injury alone does not equal warfare. So what caused them? Some of the trauma matches patterns you'd expect from dangerous hunting. If you are repeatedly driving heavy spears into massive animals, accidents happen, collisions happen. A panicked bison does not distinguish between hunters. But then there are the penetrating wounds. A small number of Neanderthal remains show sharp impacts that look very much like projectile injuries. One of the most famous cases is the Shanidar skeleton from Iraq, a male whose ribs appear to have been pierced by a light, high-speed point. Some argue this could have been an early human weapon rather than a Neanderthal one, since lighter projectiles are more characteristic of Homo sapiens. The wound was not just serious, it was potentially lethal. If this was a hunting accident, it was remarkably precise. If it was a conflict, it was deliberate. But we must not overreach. A single injury cannot rewrite prehistory. Signs of direct violence. There are a handful of cases where the evidence leans toward interpersonal violence: broken skulls from blunt force trauma, fractures consistent with club strikes, or deep cuts that suggest weapon use. But again, humans injure one another too. Neanderthals could have fought among themselves. Modern humans could have inflicted trauma on their own kind. The challenge is distinguishing species to species conflict from internal disputes. The archaeological record rarely hands us that clarity, but what we can examine are patterns. By the time humans spread widely into Europe, Neanderthal populations were small, scattered, and increasingly isolated. Their injuries, particularly in later periods, show signs of more frequent blunt force trauma. Human arrival correlates with a rise in new projectile styles: lighter, deadlier, more efficient. Some researchers propose that even if humans weren't waging war in the organized sense, they may have been willing to eliminate competing groups encountered near valuable hunting zones. A small, vulnerable Neanderthal group could easily be driven away, displaced, or killed by a larger, more mobile human band. even without any strategic plan or any notion of species-level conflict. It could be as simple as a hunting dispute gone bad. Cannibalism. Sites. Violence or survival. Several Neanderthal sites show cut marks on Neanderthal bones that indicate butchering. Cannibalism is a complex topic. It does not necessarily imply hostility. In harsh Ice Age winters, even humans have resorted to it at times. But at some sites, the disarticulation marks are so precise, so methodical, that they raise the possibility of violence between groups. Were these acts of desperation within their own species, or were they acts of hostility between species? We cannot say, but the possibility hangs in the air like frost. Forensic absences that speak loudly. Perhaps the most important evidence is not what we find, but what we don't. There are no unambiguous battle sites, no mass graves filled with Neanderthals killed by human weapons. There are no fortifications, no defensive structures, no clear examples of organized warfare. But then again, neither species built such things. Bones decay, stone scatters, sites erode, the Ice Age erases. If there were small raids, seasonal clashes, or single-band confrontations, they would vanish without a trace in 40,000 years. What we see instead is a pattern repeated across continents in human prehistory. When two intelligent apex species meet over scarce resources, conflict is not only possible, it is probable. And here in the bones, in the fractures, in the embedded points, in the silences between the layers of sediment, we glimpse that probability, not with certainty, not with a smoking spear tip, but with the weight of converging evidence. Competition sharpened, injuries increased, and contact became dangerous. The forensics point to a world where violence was possible, perhaps common, perhaps decisive, but always shrouded in ambiguity. And that leads us directly to the next question, the most dramatic of all. If conflict did occur, could humans have played a role in the disappearance of the Neanderthals? The disappearance of the Neanderthals is one of the greatest unresolved mysteries of human history. For over 200,000 years, they thrived across Europe and Western Asia, weathering harsh climates, adapting to glacial cycles, surviving predators, and mastering a world that demanded both strength and intelligence. And then, within a span of only a few thousand years, a blink in evolutionary time, they were gone. Their last known footprints disappeared from the archaeological record roughly 40,000 years ago. And what remains is not a clear narrative, but a mosaic of clues scattered across caves, bones, sediments, and our own DNA. To understand their collapse, we must gather those fragments and examine them from every angle: climate, population, disease, competition, and yes, the possibility of violence. The story of their extinction is not simple. It is not linear. It is not clean. It is a slow unraveling, a long dusk that begins long before their final shadows fade. Climate as the first pressure. The Ice Age was not a static, frozen world. It was a planet in constant motion. Sudden cold snaps, rapid warming phases, expanding forests, collapsing grasslands. These swings happened on scales of centuries or even decades. Neanderthals, born of cold-adapted lineage, could weather many of these shifts. But the period between 50,000 and 40,000 years ago brought some of the most violent climate fluctuations in the last 500,000 years. Forests retreated. Food distribution changed. Herds moved erratically. The world became more unstable, more unpredictable. This did not cause their downfall outright, but it set the stage. Because in times of abundance, coexistence is easier. In times of scarcity, every advantage matters. Small populations and fragile networks. Neanderthals lived in small, closely knit groups, likely 10 to 20 individuals, sometimes fewer. Their population across all of Eurasia may have been only 5,000 to 20,000 at any given time. That is less than the population of a small modern town spread across an entire continent. Small populations are vulnerable in ways that larger ones are not. A harsh winter doesn't just hurt them. It can erase a generation. A disease doesn't just spread. It devastates entire lineages. A single failed migration or a lost hunting opportunity can split a band, disrupt a family, or force abandonment of ancestral territory. And most importantly, small populations struggle with genetic drift and inbreeding. The DNA of late Neanderthals shows signs of shrinking diversity, evidence that their populations were already contracting before humans spread widely into Europe. It is possible, even likely, that the Neanderthals were entering a long, slow decline before Homo sapiens ever appeared in their lands in significant numbers. But a species in decline is also a species vulnerable to outside pressures. The human expansion. Modern humans entered Eurasia as a growing, flexible, interconnected population. They formed larger groups. They traded tools, ideas, and mates across much wider distances. When humans arrived, they didn't just occupy land. They spread across it. Their networks allowed them to quickly fill ecological niches, stabilize their numbers, and recover faster from hardship. Where humans grew, Neanderthals shrank. Where humans clustered, Neanderthals scattered. Where humans innovated, Neanderthals conserved. This was not a clash of superiority. It was a clash of resilience. Humans adapted faster to change. Neanderthals endured change until they no longer could. Did disease play a role? Some researchers propose that humans brought pathogens to Europe to which Neanderthals had no immunity. Even a mild disease circulating among modern humans could have been devastating to small, genetically fragile Neanderthal groups. This theory is difficult to prove archaeologically, but the genetic logic is sound. Throughout history, contact between populations with unequal immunological backgrounds has often led to collapse on the smaller side. If diseases did spread in the contact zones, we would never find their fossils. But the absence of evidence does not diminish the potential impact. Was there conflict? This is the most debated possibility, and the one most entwined with the central question of this documentary. There is no clear archaeological proof of war between humans and Neanderthals, no battlefield, no massacre site, no human tools embedded definitively in Neanderthal skeletons. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Early modern humans were capable of territorial violence. This is undeniable from later prehistory. And Neanderthals were fully human in their emotional range, survival instincts, and capacity for aggression. Conflict need not have been widespread to be decisive. A few violent encounters at critical choke points could push Neanderthals off key hunting grounds. A handful of lethal confrontations during migration seasons could redirect entire groups away from vital territory. Violence at small scales can tip ecological balance at large scales. Imagine a dwindling Neanderthal band competing for a winter cave with a growing human group. A warning, a clash, a scattering. Not war, just survival. But survival can be deadly. Assimilation, the most subtle ending. Not all endings are extinctions. Some are absorptions. Neanderthals did not vanish entirely. Their DNA lives in us, 1 to 3% in most non-Africans, higher in some isolated regions. This means that at least some Neanderthals joined human groups, integrated into human families, and became threads in our lineage. Assimilation, in this sense, is not a defeat. It is a fusion, partial, uneven, incomplete, but real. If Neanderthal numbers were already declining, even small amounts of interbreeding could lead to their genetic legacy being swallowed by a much more populous species. In this view, their disappearance was neither abrupt nor violent. It was demographic gravity, a slow absorption of a smaller population by a larger expanding one. And then they were gone. By 40,000 years ago, the last Neanderthals retreated into pockets: southern Spain, refuge valleys, isolated coastlines. These final groups left traces of diminishing tool quality, shrinking diversity, and desperate adaptation. Then the evidence stops. No final fires, no last shelters, no final carvings or tools. Only silence. Their extinction was not a single event, but a mosaic of causes: climate stress, low population, disease, displacement, competition, and possibly conflict at critical moments. Their collapse was not a story of sudden doom, but of long erosion. A species that weathered 200,000 years of Ice Age storms succumbed in the end not just to nature or violence, but to the pressures of another human species spreading across the same world. And this brings us to the most provocative and controversial question of all, the heart of Segment 6. Did humans play an active role in eliminating the Neanderthals? Or was their disappearance simply the tragic math of two species trying to survive the same unforgiving world? By now, we have walked through the landscapes they shared, the contact zones where they met, the competition that bound them together, and the pressures that drove them apart. We have seen the clues buried in bones and ash. We have watched the Neanderthal world shrink and the human world expand. And now we arrive at the most provocative and the most divisive question in the entire field of human origins. Did Homo sapiens wage war on Neanderthals? Not metaphorically, not in a vague poetic sense, but in the stark, literal meaning of the word: organized, deliberate, violent conflict. It is a question that haunts archaeology, not because it is sensational, but because it cuts to the core of what it means to be human. If our ancestors were capable of warfare 40,000 years ago, warfare not against animals or rival clans, but against another human species, then the roots of human conflict run far deeper than we once believed. But what does the evidence say? The truth is nuanced, ambiguous, layered. This segment explores every angle of the war hypothesis, not as a claim, but as an inquiry, an examination of what would be required, what the patterns suggest, and what kind of conflict, if any, could have unfolded between the last two kinds of humans on Earth. 1. What is war in a prehistoric context? Before we can discuss whether war occurred, we must understand what war would even look like 40,000 years ago. War in small hunter-gatherer societies is not battle lines, armor, or grand strategy. It is raids on hunting grounds, ambushes at water sources, conflict over seasonal shelters, night attacks on vulnerable groups, stealing or killing rivals during resource shortages, eliminating competing bands to secure territory. It is sporadic, opportunistic, and small-scale, but no less deadly for its simplicity. If such conflict occurred between humans and Neanderthals, it would leave almost no direct archaeological trace, no monuments, no mass graves, No distinctive battle debris, just pressure waves in the record of occupation, movement, and disappearance. 2. The argument for conflict. The war hypothesis begins with something simple. Competition between similar apex predators is rarely peaceful. Across nature, when two closely related species compete for the same niche, the outcome is often aggression. Wolves and coyotes, brown bears and black bears, lions and hyenas, Bengal tigers and Asiatic lions. The ecological rule is brutal. Two species occupying the same role rarely coexist without conflict. Now, consider the pressures at hand. A shrinking Ice Age world. Two species needing the same prey, water, shelter. One species, humans, expanding rapidly. One species, Neanderthals, already declining. This alone makes conflict plausible. Then there are the behavioral clues. Humans are territorial. All known human societies, even the most peaceful ones, defend resources when pressured. Neanderthals were likely territorial as well. Their deep local knowledge suggests ownership of valleys and hunting routes. Territory is identity. Territory is survival. If both species defended their spaces, clashes were inevitable. Next, we examine population size. Humans had larger, more cohesive groups. Humans could replace losses faster. Humans had broader social networks and could form alliances across bands. Neanderthals, with smaller groups, could be devastated by even minor conflict. This imbalance means that conflict, even limited conflict, would not be symmetrical. A few human raids could erase a Neanderthal lineage. A Neanderthal counterattack might wound a human group, but humans would recover faster. This asymmetry is exactly the kind of pattern that leads to displacement and eradication. Finally, there is weaponry. Humans used long-range projectiles, deadly, accurate, and launched from a distance. Neanderthals wielded close-range thrusting spears. If the two species fought, the technological advantage would be devastating. These lines of reasoning do not prove war, but they sketch the outline of how war could have happened. 3. The argument against conflict. And yet the archaeological record refuses to give us clean evidence of human on Neanderthal warfare. There are no clear massacre sites. There are no definitive projectile wounds from human weapons. There are no bones showing patterned violence between species. There are no symbolic depictions of conflict, though neither species left cave paintings of this era. This absence could mean 1. War did not happen, or Second war happened in ways that leave almost no fossil signature. Small-scale hunter-gatherer conflict is nearly invisible in deep time. Even conflicts between human groups, which we know occurred, leave minimal traces unless preserved in unusual circumstances. The archaeological silence doesn't refute conflict. It only shows that if conflict occurred, it was not large or ritualized enough to leave obvious evidence. Another argument against war: interbreeding happened. If the species were at constant war, would they have mixed genetically? Would unions have occurred at all? Yet this point cuts both ways. Interbreeding could have occurred early, before major tension, or during peaceful periods, or between isolated individuals from different groups in times of relative calm. 4. The most likely scenario: a spectrum of conflict. Rather than imagining war as a single phenomenon, we can picture something more realistic. Occasional violent encounters shaped by resource stress, territorial defense, fear, and opportunity. These could include ambushes at hunting sites, kill or be killed encounters in narrow passes, night raids on vulnerable bands, defensive killings when strangers approached camps, retaliation cycles between groups, not war as we understand it, but episodic violence that accumulated over millennia. Each violent encounter would displace groups. Each displacement would shrink Neanderthal range. Each loss of territory would reduce Neanderthal births. Each reduction in numbers would make the next conflict more lopsided. Violence in this sense does not need to be constant. It only needs to be consistent enough to create cascading demographic collapse. This is the war hypothesis in its most grounded form. Not a campaign, but a long attrition. Not battles, but pressures. Not conquest, but removal. 5. The shadow of victory. If conflict played a significant role, it contributed quietly, invisibly, relentlessly, and eventually one species stood alone, not because it intended genocide, but because its survival strategies, networks, numbers, and perhaps its aggression outcompeted its closest relative. Victory in such a world is not triumphant. It is simply survival. And survival is often brutal. Whether through intentional violence, defensive conflict, territorial displacement, or indirect pressure, humans may have played an active role in the Neanderthals' disappearance. But the evidence, what little we have, refuses to confirm or deny it absolutely. And so the war hypothesis remains a shadow, sharp-edged, plausible, but not provable. Which leads us to the final segment, the emotional, genetic, and evolutionary legacy of this encounter. Because while the Neanderthals vanished, they did not vanish completely. They live in us. If the disappearance of the Neanderthals leaves behind a physical silence, no last campfires, no final carvings, no farewell shelters, then what remains is something quieter, deeper, and far more enduring. Their legacy is not written in the earth, but in us. In our blood, our immune systems, our skull shapes, our hair and skin genes, our brain chemistry, and the faint, ancient signatures that still whisper through our DNA. The story of Homo sapiens and Neanderthals does not end with extinction. It ends with inheritance. This final segment is about those echoes, genetic, emotional, evolutionary, and symbolic. Echoes that survived long after the last Neanderthal stepped away from a fire and vanished into the Ice Age night. 1. The genetic echo. Neanderthals in our blood. Every human alive today outside Africa carries the imprint of Neanderthals, roughly 1 to 3% of our genome. It is not a trivial fragment. It is a molecular memory of contact zones, shared campsites, and rare unions across species. These genes are not decorative relics. They do things. Some boost immunity against Eurasian pathogens. Some affect skin tone and hair texture. Some influence fat storage, metabolism, and cold tolerance. And yes, a few touch brain function, circadian rhythm, mood, and stress response. In other words, Neanderthals live within the architecture of our biology. They shaped our bodies to withstand new climates. They shaped our immune systems to survive new diseases. They shaped our families, quietly, through inheritance. If there was conflict between our species, it is ironic and almost poetic that we also carry the genetic fingerprints of peace, intimacy, and integration. A species erased from the world still lives within the species that remained. 2. The cognitive echo. How we see others. The encounter between humans and Neanderthals may be the oldest example of something we still grapple with today. How we react to those who look like us but are not us. Our species is wired to identify kin, detect difference, and navigate the tension between cooperation and competition. When humans first met Neanderthals, their minds were encountering something entirely new, a being that was not an animal, yet not their own people. This cognitive shock may have shaped early myth-making, early concepts of outsiders, early territorial behaviors, early empathy, and early fear. Some anthropologists speculate that the very idea of the other may trace back in part to this meeting of human species, not provable, but evocative. The emotional imprint of that encounter may have echoed for generations, shaping stories told in firelight long after the last Neanderthal was gone. 3. The cultural echo. Possible memories in early myth. While there is no hard evidence that stories of Neanderthals survived into early human oral traditions, many cultures have myths of forest spirits, mountain giants, cave dwellers, ancient first people, human-like beings who lived before us, vanished races displaced by newcomers. These myths are widespread, from Europe to Asia to Oceania. Is this coincidence? Almost certainly. Is it intriguing? Absolutely. Some scholars wonder whether distant cultural memories, fragmentary, mythologized, blurred by time, might faintly echo ancient interactions with other human species, not as history, but as archetype, as an imprint of coexistence with beings who were human, but not quite. The Ice Age leaves few fossils of stories, but that does not mean stories were not told. 4. The emotional echo, guilt, triumph, or simply survival. There is a strange emotional weight to knowing we outlived another kind of human, as if our species carries some buried memory of the encounter, a quiet awareness that we were not always alone on this planet. Some feel pride, seeing humanity as adaptive, resilient, victorious. Some feel guilt, imagining that competition or conflict may have hastened Neanderthal decline. Some feel melancholy, recognizing that we shared the world with another kind of human intelligence and that they are gone. But perhaps the truth is simpler and more humbling. Our survival was not victory. It was luck, timing, climate, and biology. And their disappearance was not failure. It was vulnerability, pressure, and fate. The emotional echo is the recognition that we are the last branch on a tree that once had many, and that our existence is not inevitable. It is inherited from those who did not make it. 5. The evolutionary echo, a shared path forward. The meeting of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens was not just an ending. It was a fusion that shaped the future of humanity. The Neanderthal genes we carry influence our modern traits in ways subtle and profound. Some help us resist viruses. Some alter the way we process sunlight. Some may affect how we sleep or respond to stress. These traits play out now, not in Ice Age valleys, but in modern lives. The legacy of Neanderthals is alive in us every day. Their disappearance was a loss. Their absorption was a legacy. Their memory is written in the molecules that build us. 6. The final echo, we are not alone in our origins. The story of humans and Neanderthals is often framed as triumph, tragedy, or conflict. But at its heart, it is a story about connection. Two species intertwined for thousands of years across the harshest landscapes the Earth has ever known. Neanderthals were not our enemies. They were not our opposites. They were simply another kind of human trying to survive the same unforgiving world. Their disappearance was not a single event, but a long twilight. Their legacy is not a ruin, but a resonance. And in that resonance, the final echo emerges. We are not the only story humanity ever told. We are simply the last chapter still being written.